The vacuum dome stood at the far edge of the Galactic Academy's training grounds, like a silent monument to failure. It was a structure forged from transparent alloy plates, so cold that frost clung to the inner walls even though nothing inside held enough warmth to melt it. The dome had a reputation older than most instructors. Every cadet who had ever stepped into it had walked out gasping in fear long before the time limit, and many alien species had learned to avoid volunteering for it altogether. It was said that only a creature born in the emptiness of space itself could survive the dome's atmospheric purge, but none had ever proven this rumor true. The instructors used the dome as a demonstration of absolute limits, a teaching tool meant to show every student that some environments could not be conquered. The purpose was to humble, not to train. On this cold morning, a group of cadets gathered before the entrance platform, shuffling nervously as the instructors prepared the trial. Most of them belonged to species that had grown up in thick atmospheres or warm seas, and the idea of stepping into a place where pressure dropped close to zero made them tremble. The instructors always spoke calmly, describing what would happen, but cadets remembered the way previous challengers had staggered out, clutching their chests and collapsing on the ground. Some had panic attacks, some fainted. A few never volunteered for anything again. Marcus Hale, the only human in this cycle of training, stood modestly in the back of the crowd. He wore the standard survival suit with the visor lifted to show his face. His posture was relaxed, almost indifferent, as if he were simply waiting for a transport shuttle rather than a test that no species had ever passed. One of the instructors, a tall Arcanian with pale scales and silver eyes, glanced at him several times, clearly confused by his lack of reaction. The Arcanian had overseen hundreds of failed attempts, but had never trained a human before, and he had quietly assumed that Marcus would be the most fragile cadet in the group. Humans, in the Academy's data sheets, were described as atmospherically dependent and biologically rigid, which in practice meant that Marcus should have been the least suitable candidate for this trial. The other cadets whispered among themselves, not bothering to lower their voices. A tall Karu male crossed all four of his arms over his massive chest and muttered that the human probably did not understand what the dome actually did. A slender Moor female shook her head and said that the human's blood would boil instantly if he took one step inside. A Yigzari cadet, who had blue fur that bristled when he was anxious, said that the instructors should not even allow Marcus near the entrance. The entire training group turned to watch him, expecting him to tremble, hesitate, or step back. Instead, Marcus calmly examined the dome's entrance seals as though inspecting the craftsmanship. The dome technician activated the control tablet, and a deep hum filled the air. The floor panels vibrated, and the outer locks separated with a sharp metallic click. The cadets fell silent. The instructor raised his voice to make an announcement, explaining that the test this morning would be optional, as always, and that any cadet who wished to leave was free to do so without consequence. The words carried a clear message. Stepping inside was dangerous, foolish, and practically guaranteed to end in failure. Several cadets stepped back immediately. The dome had claimed the confidence of stronger species than theirs. But before the instructor finished the last sentence, Marcus stepped forward. His shadow stretched across the frost-covered platform, unmistakable and steady. The entire group turned toward him as if watching someone walk willingly into an execution chamber. For a moment, even the instructor lost his composure. He hesitated, then asked Marcus if he understood the parameters. Marcus nodded once. The nod was small, almost casual, yet it carried a certainty that unsettled the entire audience. The instructor tried to caution him again, but Marcus lifted a hand politely, signaling that he heard and accepted everything. The instructor swallowed hard and motioned for him to step onto the platform. Every cadet watched him ascend the ramp. The frost beneath his boots cracked like thin glass. As he reached the outer seal, he paused, not because of fear, but because he was studying the mechanics of the pressure-locked door. He examined the tiny vents, the condensation patterns, and the light strips embedded in the alloy. The onlookers thought he was hesitating. In truth, Marcus was adapting. He was already imagining how his lungs would react when the pressure fell and how he could control his breathing to keep himself conscious long enough to find a rhythm. The instructor announced the beginning of the cycle. He explained that the dome would drain its air entirely during the first 30 seconds, that the temperature inside would drop rapidly, and that no biological organism had ever remained inside for the full 20-minute survival period. The cadets stared wide-eyed as Marcus placed his hands at his sides, breathed out slowly, and prepared to step inside. The entrance seal opened with a hiss, revealing the barren interior lit only by pale blue emergency stripes. No sound came from within, because sound could not travel properly in a chamber designed to eliminate atmosphere. Marcus looked inside as if he were inspecting a simple empty room. As the human stepped over the threshold, the cadets leaned forward. The sealed door closed behind him with a resonant metallic thud. The transparent walls allowed the cadets to see Marcus clearly. He stood alone, centered, motionless, except for the faint rise and fall of his chest. Then the purge system activated. The inner vents flared open, and the atmosphere began to vacuum out of the dome. Frost slithered across the walls. Marcus's hair swayed slightly in the sudden outflow of air before dropping flat as the pressure plummeted. The purge warning lights flashed red. Cadets instinctively covered their faces, even though the danger was contained. The Karu male muttered that this was the part where most challengers panicked. The Moor female whispered that Marcus would collapse immediately, but he did not. He lowered his chin, exhaled deliberately, and tightened his abdominal muscles to regulate the drop in internal pressure. His eyes narrowed slightly, not in pain, but in concentration. His body reacted violently at first. His veins pressed against his skin, and his breath thinned to a faint mist, but he anchored his thoughts, forcing his breathing into a controlled rhythm. The instructors stared at him through the glass barrier, their expressions slowly shifting from annoyance to disbelief. The dome's hum grew louder as it reached near-perfect vacuum. Marcus's suit, though protective, was not built for extended exposure, and the visor's inner layer trembled under the temperature shift. Frost surrounded him, encasing him in a crystalline haze. Even from outside, cadets could see his struggle. His fingers flexed to keep circulation active, his posture tightened, and his jaw clenched slightly. But no panic appeared in his eyes. He looked forward steadily, grounding himself as if he were weathering a rough wind rather than the lethal absence of atmosphere. The instructors exchanged glances, speaking quietly. Every species that had attempted this trial relied on natural physiological traits: internal membranes, pressure sacs, multi-tiered lungs, and all had failed within minutes. Marcus had none of those. By all biological logic, he should have been the first to collapse, yet he endured the purge cycle's most brutal phase without flinching. He did not attempt to signal for release. He did not reach for emergency mechanisms. He stood unmoving, fully aware that the dome was designed to break even the strongest cadets. As the final traces of atmosphere vanished and silence consumed the chamber, Marcus closed his eyes briefly, centering himself. From the outside, he appeared to be a statue carved from frost and determination. Nothing about his expression suggested despair. Instead, there was a strange calm, as if he had expected this level of difficulty. The cadets watched him with widening eyes, realizing that the human had stepped into a test that no one was meant to pass and was treating it not as doom, but as a challenge he fully intended to overcome. In that moment, before any improvisation, before any invention, before any heroic display of human ingenuity, Marcus did something that no species had ever accomplished inside the vacuum dome. He remained standing. The purge cycle ended with a shudder that ran through the transparent alloy walls, and Marcus felt the temperature sink into a deeper, darker cold. The dome was now silent, emptied of breath, sound, and warmth. He felt the ache spreading through his chest, but he forced himself to remain calm, drifting into a controlled pattern of breathing that he had practiced long before ever setting foot on this alien moon. He knew that the hardest part was not the absence of air, but the temptation to let panic take over. Panic wasted energy. Panic accelerated suffocation. Panic killed. He anchored his thoughts on everything he could still control, and one idea kept returning to him, a method he had been testing in his mind since the beginning of training. The vacuum dome had one vulnerability. The environmental cycling system left behind thin layers of condensed frost on the inner walls. Ice formed rapidly and consistently due to the drastic temperature changes. That ice was dense, compacted in seconds, unlike natural ice that formed slowly on Earth. Marcus had noticed something else too. Fragments of moss, a hardy species adapted to the moon's frigid surface, often clung to the dome's exterior vents. It survived through a strange metabolic process that allowed it to absorb traces of moisture and microscopic elements even in near vacuum. The instructors regarded it as a harmless nuisance. Marcus saw potential in it. He had not been allowed to bring tools, but the dome itself was filled with materials. If he could combine them in a way that slowed the damage of the vacuum, he might gain enough breathable air to stay conscious. His first step was movement. The moment he shifted from his position in the center of the dome, the watching cadets stirred. They expected him to fail the instant he exerted himself, but he ignored the shapes behind the glass and moved toward the frost-coated wall with slow, deliberate steps. Each step sent a sharp pain through his joints, and his breath left his body in thin bursts that dissipated instantly. He tested his gloves against the wall. The ice resisted at first, clinging to the alloy like crystal armor, but after a moment it cracked under his pressure and loosened into jagged shards. He gathered them carefully, shaping them into a curved surface that he pressed between his palms until they fused together again, forming a thick slab. The cold bit into his skin through the suit, numbing his fingers, but he welcomed the distraction. He continued working until he created a hollow within the ice slab. He did not need a perfect container. He only needed something that could hold the moss and trap a thin layer of oxygen long enough to filter it. He pressed his visor close to the ice, watching the way the frost handled the faint warmth from his breath. It softened unevenly, leaving small tunnels of moisture inside the ice. That was what he needed. A filter worked best when air could pass through different densities of material. The instructors outside the dome exchanged confused looks as Marcus knelt down again, his body hunched over the growing mass of ice. To them, it appeared as if he had chosen to play with frozen debris rather than try to survive. None of them understood that he was building a tool. Once he shaped the ice, he turned his attention to the second component. He needed moss. He scanned the edges of the floor panels, leaning close to the ground where small vents released heat during the dome's cycling phases. Thin strands of moss clung there, barely visible unless one searched for them directly. Marcus crouched low and scraped as much as he could with a gloved fingertip. The moss crackled faintly when touched, its brittle structure altered by the extreme cold. He knew that it was not alive in any thriving sense, yet it retained a metabolic potential locked inside its filaments. If he could apply warmth from his own breath and body, it might reactivate just enough to process air trapped in the ice. He gathered more than he needed, storing it inside a fold of his suit until the fibers softened slightly from the heat. The mixture of his exhaled moisture and his body temperature revived the moss just enough for its color to brighten from pale gray to muted green. This was the moment of commitment. If the moss failed, he would lose precious oxygen. If the ice cracked too quickly, the structure would collapse. But if he did nothing, he would collapse anyway. Survival depended on improvisation. He knelt again and pushed the moss into the hollow he had carved inside the ice. The texture scratched the glove, leaving faint marks. But the moss settled nicely, forming an uneven layer that clung to the inner wall. The cold of the ice pushed the moss toward a dormant state, but Marcus breathed softly into the opening, warming the interior just enough to encourage the moss to begin its microscopic activity. His breath fogged instantly, leaving moisture suspended within the ice structure. This was crucial. Moisture would prolong the moss's active period, granting him more oxygen in return. Marcus then examined the visor of his suit. He needed a sealing mechanism. The visor edges had several small cracks from previous training sessions, and though the suit's system compensated for them, he understood that the cracked pieces could serve as makeshift sealing shards. He pressed his thumb against one crack, feeling the weakened area. With enough pressure and the right angle, he could separate a small fragment without damaging the rest of the visor. It was a risk. If the visor broke too much, he would lose the only protection his eyes and lungs had from the vacuum. He inhaled, held the breath, and applied pressure. The visor groaned softly, and a tiny piece loosened. He worked slowly, methodically, isolating only the fractured edges until he had several curved shards. He aligned them over the ice hollow and pressed them into place, sealing the moss chamber with a transparent lid that held the fragile structure together. Now he had a crude breathing stone, a device that could recycle a small amount of air through the moss and release it through microscopic gaps in the ice. He lifted the device carefully, holding it close to his face. It was heavy, cold, and imperfect, but it worked. He pressed it against the lower part of his visor, positioning it to direct the oxygen toward his mouth. The ice chilled his skin, but he welcomed it. Cold slowed biological reactions, meaning the moss might last longer. He inhaled slowly, drawing in the faint but unmistakable taste of filtered air. It was weak, but it was life. Through the transparent walls, the cadets and instructors stared in stunned silence. Some leaned closer, unsure what they were seeing. The Karu male muttered something in disbelief, while the Moor female lifted a hand to her chest as if witnessing a miracle. The instructors exchanged rapid remarks, trying to determine what the human had built. No species in the academy had ever considered crafting tools during a purge. No species had ever thought about combining ice and moss into a filtration device. The dome was intended to strip cadets of options, to force them to face their limits with nothing but their physiology. Yet Marcus had turned the dome into a workshop. He closed his eyes briefly, letting the filtered air settle into his lungs. His pulse calmed. The pain in his chest softened. The dizziness receded just enough for clarity to return. He knew he had not saved himself completely. The device would fail eventually. The ice would crack. The moss would die. But he did not need a perfect solution. He needed time. Time to regulate his breathing, to maintain consciousness, and to push through the limits that every other species had accepted without question. Marcus adjusted the device again, ensuring a tight seal. Then he looked forward with an expression that no one outside the dome expected to see. Determination, steady and absolute. The trial was not over. It had barely begun. The weight of the ice and moss device in Marcus's hands reminded him that every second inside the dome had become a negotiation with his own endurance. He pressed the cold structure against the lower edge of his visor and felt the filtered air push faintly toward his mouth. It was not a comfortable sensation. The oxygen came through in uneven pulses, each breath thin and metallic, carrying the faint mineral taste of frozen moisture and the earthy residue of the moss. But every inhale was enough to keep him conscious, and consciousness was the only currency that mattered now. He straightened his back and allowed his eyes to adjust to the dim blue illumination rippling across the dome's walls. The lights were designed to simulate clarity, yet in the vacuum they shimmered strangely, creating a visual distortion that made the environment feel larger and emptier than it truly was. Outside the dome, cadets clustered near the transparent barrier. Their silhouettes formed an uneven ring of elongated shadows that shifted with every flicker of the emergency lights. Some of the cadets pressed their faces close to the glass, watching Marcus with disbelief. Others stood frozen, as if witnessing something that defied sense. The instructors did not speak. Their usual stoic composure had melted into a tense silence as they evaluated the human's movements. Marcus knew none of this. All he heard was the hollow vibration of his heartbeat echoing faintly through his skull. He paced slowly across the interior, testing his limbs and gauging the oxygen distribution. Each step felt as if he were walking through a thick, invisible barrier. The low pressure affected his balance, forcing him to rely on muscle memory more than instinct. His body wanted to shake, but he refused to let it. He kept his breaths shallow and controlled, allowing the moss inside the ice to do its quiet work. When he reached the far side of the dome, he paused to observe how the light refracted through the frost. The ice that clung to the alloy walls resembled fragile feathers that glistened with every shift of illumination. Beneath those layers of frost, the cold alloy radiated a dull lifelessness that chilled even the air trapped inside Marcus's filter. He lowered himself carefully until he was kneeling, keeping the device steady as he examined the ground. Micro cracks spidered along the floor panels, created by the rapid shifts in temperature. He ran his gloved hand across the cracked surface, feeling the rhythmic tremors of the pressure-stabilizing system beneath. Everything inside the dome was engineered to test the biological resilience of cadets, not their inventiveness. It offered no comfort, no foothold, no hidden pockets of warmth. Yet its rigid stability provided something else: predictability. Marcus needed predictability more than comfort. The cold seeped through his suit, but the pain kept his focus sharp. He traced a thin fracture along the floor with his fingertip, watching how the crystals formed along its edges. The moisture frozen inside the crack shimmered faintly. He understood immediately what this meant. The dome, despite the designer's intentions, generated enough rapid temperature cycling to create consistent frost layers in every corner. If he managed to regulate his breathing and movement, he could use the dome's own environment to maintain the temperature of his filter. He pressed the device against the crack and waited. The ice inside the filter cooled further, slowing its melting rate. The moss reacted by entering a near-dormant state, but the faint flow of recycled air still reached him with each measured inhale. He stood again, gripping the device firmly with one hand to keep it sealed. His other hand rested against the wall for stability. His vision wavered momentarily as his blood reacted to the pressure conditions. A wave of dizziness threatened to unbalance him, but he leaned into the cold wall and steadied himself. He forced a slow exhale, releasing a thin ribbon of vapor that vanished instantly. He focused on that single breath, reminding himself that control, always control, was the only path forward. His heart pounded inside his chest with a deep throb that resonated through his ribs. He adjusted the device again and took a careful step back, then another, testing the strain each movement placed on his oxygen supply. Outside the dome, the instructors exchanged uneasy glances. One instructor, a tall Arcanian, pressed a clawed hand against the barrier as if trying to understand the human's intentions. Marcus's movements were deliberate, not erratic or panicked. He was studying the environment, reinforcing his survival pattern, adapting with each passing second. The Arcanian whispered something to another instructor, though Marcus could not hear it. He did not need to. He could imagine the conversation. Humans had been cataloged as biologically weak, but the instructors were beginning to reassess their classifications. Marcus paced the interior again, moving with caution and purpose. He felt the edges of his consciousness sharpening, then dulling, then sharpening again. The cycle resembled tidal shifts, pushing him toward the brink of exhaustion before pulling him back just enough to keep him standing. He refused to let the rhythm break him. He used it instead, timing his breaths to coincide with the faint pulses of recycled air the filter produced. His fingers curled tightly around the ice structure, absorbing its numbing cold through the layers of his gloves. The numbness spread up his arm, forcing his muscles to move more slowly, more carefully. He welcomed the sensation. It reduced the strain on his oxygen-starved system. He reached the center of the dome again, stopping beneath the main light strip. The dim illumination cast his shadow in a thin crescent around his boots. He lowered the device slightly to test the seal and listened for any sound at all. Nothing reached his ears. The dome swallowed all noise. Even the sound of his own breath felt muted, as if filtered through layers of glass. The silence pressed against him with a weight heavier than the absence of air, but he held firm. Silence was not danger, silence was information. It told him the purge was stable. It told him the structure was intact. It told him he had time. He closed his eyes for a moment and allowed the cold to settle deeper into his muscles. The ice filter created a faint vibration as it responded to the pressure difference. The moss inside shifted slightly, releasing a barely perceptible pulse of oxygen. He inhaled, feeling the thin air cool his throat. His lungs expanded slowly, resisting the vacuum's pull. He steadied his heartbeat with focused concentration, imagining each beat as a step forward, each inhale as a blade cutting through the suffocating void. Time inside the dome stretched into something unmeasurable. There were no sounds, no movements except his own, no cues to rely on. Marcus tracked time through his body, how his fingers tingled, how his muscles trembled when the cold rose through his arms, how the filtered air shifted as the moss adapted. Every sensation guided him. He knew that the trial was not meant for creative solutions, but that did not matter. Survival never asked permission. It demanded innovation. When he opened his eyes again, he found his reflection faintly outlined in the frost on the wall. His features were partially obscured by the visor's fogging and the distortion of the ice, but he could still see the steady determination in his gaze. He straightened his posture and adjusted the filter one more time. He felt the stiffening of his limbs, the weakness forming in his knees, but he stood firm. The dome might have stripped the environment of everything necessary for life, but Marcus refused to let it strip away his resolve. He walked another slow circuit along the perimeter, each step carefully measured. His breath came in controlled intervals. His fingers tightened around the filter as the ice creaked softly, signaling the early stages of structural stress. He knew the device would not last forever. The cracks forming inside the ice were small, but they multiplied with every drop in temperature. He moved toward a colder section of the dome, hoping to prolong the integrity of the structure. The cold bit into his skin again, but this time he welcomed it with relief. The moss responded to the temperature shift by slowing even further, yet the oxygen flow did not stop. It merely weakened, forcing Marcus to adjust his breathing pattern once more. He inhaled deeply, exhaled slowly, and allowed the rhythm to stabilize. His lungs tightened painfully, but he fought through the sensation, grounding himself with determination that felt heavier than the dome itself. Outside, the cadets had fallen into complete silence. No one moved. No one dared to speak. The instructors stared at him through the barrier with a mixture of astonishment and dawning respect. For the first time, the vacuum dome, long considered an unbeatable trial, felt vulnerable. And Marcus, standing alone inside the frozen chamber, felt a quiet certainty settle inside him. He was not finished. The trial would continue, and he intended to endure every second that followed. The cracks in the ice filter spread with a slow, unsettling rhythm, each one stretching like a thin vein beneath the frozen surface. Marcus felt the vibrations through the gloves of his suit as he held the device close to his visor. The fractures made a faint tremor that pulsed against his palms, warning him that the structure was losing integrity. He repositioned the filter again, angling it slightly downward to preserve the remaining moisture. The moss inside the hollow shifted with every tiny movement, its fibers squeezing faint traces of oxygen from the last remnants of condensed vapor. He inhaled carefully, drawing in air that tasted weaker and colder with every breath. The dome around him seemed to tighten. The silence grew into something heavy, pressing against him like a physical force. His own heartbeat echoed inside his skull with dull, uneven thuds. His lungs strained against the vacuum, trembling with each slow inhale. His limbs had grown so numb that he could barely feel the textured grip of his gloves against the ice, but he refused to surrender to the fatigue dragging at his muscles. He kept his steps steady, his breaths controlled, his thoughts focused on the single idea that kept him upright: endure. The cold deepened with each passing moment as the dome's internal temperature continued its gradual decline. The emergency lights overhead flickered, casting thin glimmers across the frost-covered walls. The illumination dimmed, then strengthened, then dimmed again, creating a faint strobing effect that disoriented him. Marcus blinked through the blur forming across his visor, trying to maintain clarity. The shifting lights made the frost glitter in chaotic waves, as if the dome were breathing in slow, shallow gasps. He steadied himself by bracing one hand against the wall, though even that contact sent a sharp, freezing jolt through his arm. He closed his eyes for a moment, allowing the cold to settle deeper, because the numbness was better than the pain that followed when sensation returned. The ice filter pressed against his visor with a faint crackling sound, signaling the start of the next fracture. He did not dare adjust it too much, afraid that even the slightest pressure might shatter it. The moss inside continued its slow metabolic reaction, producing the thin oxygen flow that kept him conscious, but he could feel the decline. Each inhale delivered less than the last. His lungs expanded reluctantly, fighting the pressure difference that threatened to collapse them inward. A wave of dizziness washed over him. His vision stretched, blurring the shapes of the cadets outside the dome into distorted shadows. He staggered, dropping one knee to the frozen ground, and the impact sent a shock of pain up his leg. He gritted his teeth and held the filter firmly against his visor, forcing himself to focus on the rhythmic flow of oxygen that still reached him. He counted each inhale, matching it to the soundless rhythm of his heartbeat. He repeated the pattern again and again, refusing to let his mind drift into the slow, dangerous fog creeping through his thoughts. His suit, though insulated, was never designed to withstand long exposure to near-vacuum conditions. The internal systems struggled to regulate his temperature as the dome's environment pushed beyond their limits. Frost crept along the seams of his boots and elbows, forming small crystalline webs. He flexed his fingers, trying to restore a hint of circulation, but his hand barely responded. His breath fogged the inside of the visor, leaving a thin layer of condensation that obscured his view. He wiped it with the back of his wrist, but the blur remained, a constant reminder of how fragile his survival had become. Marcus forced himself to stand again, using the wall for support as he rose. The ice cracks in the filter spidered further, forming a branching pattern that stretched dangerously close to the chamber holding the moss. He examined it quickly, his mind racing through potential adjustments. The filter would break soon. He knew that. But he also knew that timing mattered. If it broke too early, the shock of losing oxygen could knock him unconscious. If it lasted just long enough, he could use the remaining seconds to stabilize his breathing manually. He braced the filter with both hands, letting the cold numb his fingers completely. He took a slow step forward, then another, moving toward the point in the dome where the temperature was lowest. The cold was brutal, but it slowed the cracking of the ice. He pressed the filter against his visor again and adjusted his breathing, allowing the weakened oxygen flow to synchronize with his heartbeat. The rhythm steadied him, though he felt the trembling beginning in his legs. Each breath cost him more effort than the last. The cold seeped deeper into his chest, spreading like a dull ache that constricted his lungs. He forced his thoughts into order, clearing away the fear that threatened to rise with every weak inhale. The viewing platform outside the dome was filled now. Instructors stood motionless, their faces drawn tight with disbelief. Cadets who had previously mocked him were silent, their expressions tense as they watched Marcus shift his weight and continue forward. To them, it looked like desperation, but Marcus knew better. This was strategy. Every movement, every breath, every decision was deliberate. He reached the edge of the dome where the frost was thickest and knelt again, letting the cold reinforce the structure of the ice. The fractures in the filter slowed, no longer spreading as quickly. He felt himself losing strength, but he refused to collapse. His breathing pattern devolved into uneven cycles, but he corrected each deviation with sheer force of will. He inhaled through the filter, exhaled through tightened lips, and repeated the cycle, grounding himself in the familiar discipline of controlled respiration. His vision blurred again, but he leaned forward, pressing the filter tighter against his visor. The device groaned under the pressure. A faint crack echoed in his ears, not through sound, but through vibration. A large fracture split across the ice, bisecting the structure. Marcus steadied it with both hands, pushing his palms together to keep it from breaking apart completely. The moss inside shifted violently as the ice moved, releasing a sudden burst of oxygen that washed over him like a shock wave. He inhaled deeply, savoring the wave of clarity it brought. But the burst was temporary. The moss had given everything it could. The next inhale was thinner, the next thinner still. The filter had reached its breaking point. Marcus lowered himself, sitting on his heels, and braced the filter with one hand while placing the other over his chest. He could feel his heartbeat turning erratic, skipping beats, then pounding harder in a frantic attempt to compensate. His lungs tightened, resisting the vacuum with decreasing success. He felt the cold closing in on him from every angle, stripping away his strength until even lifting his head felt exhausting. But despite the pain, despite the suffocating pressure, despite the failing filter, Marcus refused to surrender. His mind sharpened with a clarity that came only in moments of extreme danger. He drew one more breath through the filter and exhaled with a steady, controlled release. His willpower anchored him as the ice structure trembled violently in his weakening grip. Outside the dome, one cadet stepped backward, unable to watch. Another covered her mouth with her hand. The instructors leaned closer to the glass, stunned by the sheer persistence of a human who had no natural adaptations for such an environment. They expected him to collapse at any moment. But Marcus did not collapse. Not yet. He lifted the filter again and held it in place with every last ounce of strength he had left. The fractures glowed faintly in the dim blue light, forming a web of shimmering lines across the ice. The moss inside pulsed weakly. The cold pressed deeper into his bones. This was the final threshold, the moment when biology alone could no longer sustain him, the point where instinct failed and only human resolve remained. And Marcus stood at its edge, unwavering. The moment the ice filter finally cracked apart, Marcus felt the shift deep in his chest. The fracture spread with a rapid, splintering snap that vibrated through both of his arms. The structure split into two uneven halves, each piece slipping slightly in his grip. A thin burst of air escaped from between the shards. A last, desperate exhale from the moss sealed within. Marcus inhaled sharply, capturing the final rush of oxygen before it dissipated into the vacuum. The fleeting clarity washed through him like a wave of light, but he knew it would not last. His lungs trembled, his legs weakened, and a cold numbness began to spread into his shoulders. He tightened his grip on the fragments, using his forearms to hold them together long enough to slow the final collapse of the device. The cold inside the dome had grown harsher, turning every breath into a battle. His body reacted violently to the pressure conditions as the last remnants of the filter failed. His chest constricted, forcing each inhale to become a shallow gasp. His throat burned, and the ringing in his ears intensified until it drowned out even the faint thrum of the dome's stabilizers. His vision shifted into a tunnel, the edges dimming as if a veil were being pulled slowly across his eyes. He lowered himself onto one knee again, not from surrender, but from strategy. If he stayed upright, he risked fainting from the sudden drop in oxygen flow. Lowering his center of gravity gave him precious seconds to stabilize his breathing. He pressed the broken halves of the ice filter against his visor, trapping the remaining oxygen between the cracks. The moss inside had lost almost all metabolic activity, but the frozen moisture lingering between the ice layers still held a trace of life. Marcus angled the shards to direct every molecule of air toward his mouth, refusing to waste a single inhale. He breathed slowly, carefully, squeezing every ounce of usefulness from the broken device. Outside the dome, the cadets watched him through the transparent barrier with a mixture of fear and disbelief. The viewing platform had grown completely silent, filled now with instructors, technicians, and other personnel who had arrived after hearing reports that the human had survived far longer than any previous challenger. Some stood frozen, their eyes wide, unable to understand how someone without specialized physiology could endure so long. Others leaned forward, mesmerized by the raw determination radiating through the dome walls. The Arcanian instructor, who had initially dismissed Marcus as the weakest participant, gripped the railing until the metal bent faintly beneath his hands. Inside, Marcus forced his lungs to contract in slow, measured cycles. His heartbeat thudded with an uneven, panicked rhythm that threatened to plunge him into unconsciousness. He knew the cycle was ending soon. The dome always released pressure at the end of the trial, gradually restoring the atmosphere in predefined increments. He needed to last until the first increment activated. If he fainted even a few seconds early, the vacuum would overwhelm his weakened body, and he would never wake again. He tightened his jaw and focused on the faint warmth inside his chest, a memory of oxygen rather than the real thing. His muscles shook violently, and his hands trembled so badly that the ice shards nearly slipped from his grip. He refused to let them fall. The first sound he heard was not a sound at all, but a vibration, a deep, resonant pulse running through the floor panels. His eyes snapped open. The pressure restoration mechanism had activated. The dome lights shifted from pale blue to a muted purple, signaling the beginning of the repressurization sequence. Marcus drew in one more faint breath through the cracked filter and lowered it slowly from his face. He kept the pieces close, but he no longer pressed them to his visor. The emergency sequence would deliver enough air for him to survive if he remained conscious for just a little longer. The rush of atmosphere entered the dome in thin streams, invisible but powerful. Marcus felt the pressure easing against his lungs, though the sudden shift made his chest ache. His ears popped sharply, sending a jolt of pain through his skull. He braced himself with one hand on the ground as oxygen finally entered the dome in measurable amounts. His breathing deepened, though every inhale burned like fire. His body reacted with violent coughs that forced him to double over. He pressed his forehead against the cold floor as he fought to regain control. But even through the pain, he understood that he was past the worst. The dome was no longer trying to kill him. It was allowing him to live. The repressurization continued in waves. With each pulse of air, Marcus felt sensation return to his fingers and toes in agonizing spikes. His muscles cramped as warmth spread through them. The frost along his suit's seams began to melt into small droplets. He lifted his head slowly, his breath forming mist again. Not faint, fragile mist, but full, warm vapor that expanded across the inside of his visor. He blinked through the blur, watching the walls of the dome shift as the light returned to normal. His vision sharpened enough for him to see his own reflection again, ghostly and pale, but undeniably alive. As the inner doors of the dome unlocked, the instructors surged toward the entrance. The Arcanian instructor reached the control panel first and slammed his palm against the manual release. The outer seal disengaged with a long metallic sigh, and the door slid open. A rush of warm air spilled inside, engulfing Marcus in a wave of sensation that nearly overwhelmed him. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the first full inhale he had felt since stepping inside the dome. He pushed himself up slowly, using the last reserves of strength left in his trembling legs. The broken fragments of the ice filter slipped from his hands and fell to the floor, scattering into a dozen pieces. The moss inside had turned gray and lifeless. Marcus stared at it for a moment, feeling a strange mixture of gratitude and finality. The device had served its purpose. It had remained intact long enough for him to reach the moment when the dome began to restore air. Without it, he would have collapsed long before. He took a step toward the door. His knees buckled under him, but he caught himself with one hand against the wall. The instructors rushed into the dome, but none touched him. They had strict orders. No contact until the dome's internal sensors confirmed his vitals were stable enough to allow assistance. Marcus steadied himself with a deep breath and forced his legs to move again. Each movement felt like lifting a mountain, but he refused to collapse here. He refused to let his victory end in exhaustion on the cold alloy floor. When he finally crossed the threshold, the cadets parted instinctively, forming a wide path that led to the center of the observation platform. Marcus took one more step, then another, and finally came to a stop as oxygen filled his lungs fully for the first time since the trial began. His chest rose with a long, steady inhale, and he exhaled with trembling relief. The instructors surrounded him, scanning his vitals, checking his suit, evaluating every sign of physical distress. But none spoke. None interrupted the moment. The silence around him was not the silence of shock anymore. It was the silence of respect. The Arcanian instructor finally stepped forward. His silver eyes held an expression Marcus had never seen from him before, a mixture of awe, humility, and grudging admiration. He lifted his hand and touched 2 fingers to his own throat, the Arcanian gesture of acknowledgement and respect. Marcus did not speak. He simply met the instructor's gaze, steady and calm. The Academy had created the vacuum dome as a lesson in limitations, a reminder that some environments were impossible to endure. But Marcus had shown something no instructor had expected to see. He had not survived because he was strong. He had not survived because he was resistant to cold or pressure. He had survived because he refused to accept the limits written into the training manuals. As he stood there, breathing freely again, the cadets looked at him with wide eyes, no longer filled with doubt or ridicule, but with the dawning understanding that something fundamental had changed. The Academy would update its records, the instructors would rewrite their expectations, and future cadets would hear a story that would echo through the halls for years to come. The vacuum dome was no longer unbeatable, because a human, armed with nothing but ice, moss, fragments of glass, and unrelenting determination, had proven that even the deadliest environment could be conquered by ingenuity, resilience, and will. And for the first time since the Academy was founded, the impossible had been rewritten.